Hi all and welcome back to Social Worker Saga. My name's Nick James. This is the second part of a series on the word need in the context of child assessment and development. When I'm assessing children's developmental needs, I'm thinking about the things which promote healthy development in children. I'm looking to see which of these are or are not being adequately provided for the child. In this video, I'm going to look at what this means in greater detail. But first, there's an oversimplification alert. I'm going to be describing some seriously complex concepts here in very, very basic terms. It's not important for you to understand the full complexities, I certainly don't, but having some knowledge of the concepts around biological and psychological and physiological development will help you think about them more clearly, which will then help you write about them more clearly. You may have heard of the nature versus nurture debate, whether a person's development depends on their genetics, their genes, that's nature, or how they're cared for and what they learn as they're being raised, that's nurture. In reality, nature and nurture intermix in complicated ways. One of those ways is a thing called epigenetics. When we're born, our bodies are genetically capable of going in all sorts of directions, and what happens to us during our development toggles these little switches in our genetics that can send our development in different directions depending on life experiences. For example, a young child born into a world, into a country where there's a famine going on, and that young child grows up without much to eat. And because they don't have much to eat, they may develop to be smaller in size as an adult. The reason for that is that when they were young and their body was developing, their body noted that they were regularly hungry. And because they noted that, they switched off the grow big genes so that that child wouldn't require so much food to be pushed towards their growth. Bigger people require more food each day, so by not growing so big, the child was less likely to starve before getting to adulthood. They might be on the smaller side as an adult, but at least they're alive, and because they're small, they're more likely to survive in a time of scarcity. That smaller adult may, in the due course of time, have children of their own, and the famine ends, and so those children are born into a country where there's plenty of food and they're well fed. Those children's bodies in turn note that they're not hungry and so can use a lot of food on growing. Their grow big switch doesn't get toggled off, and they can end up being quite a bit larger than their parent. Similar things can happen with all areas of development, not just the physical, so personality, mental health, behaviour and more. You may have heard of people having predispositions for certain conditions like diabetes or maybe some types of cancer. Usually those things run in their families. But for any individual, they may or they may not get that, but whether they do end up with those conditions will depend on both genetic and epigenetic factors. We know what some common ones are, so diet, exercise, smoking, etc. But others are only suspected, and some others may not be understood at all. Now, please remember, this description of epigenetics is massively oversimplified for a short video about social work. But I wanted to make sure that you had some sort of understanding of these concepts about how external forces can shape childhood development. There's a link in the show notes to another video on epigenetics to give you more information if you're interested. Now, psychological and emotional development work in similar ways. It's just a different kind of growth switch that's getting toggled. Elements of this may also be genetic or epigenetic, like predisposition to certain mental health difficulties. But again, whether those switches get toggled will be due to things that happen in the child's life. So whether they get enough support or whether they experience, certain types of trauma and so on. The way that the child's physiological, psychological and emotional needs are met can help determine how they turn out later in life. In many ways, children are development machines. From before they're born until they're well into adulthood, almost everything that happens to them in some way contributes towards their development. At different ages, at different stages of development, they're going to have different needs. Now, if earlier needs, when they were much younger, are met or not met, that's then going to have a knock-on effect later on in their life to what they're going to need at those times. So when we're talking about children's developmental needs, we're talking about the things that toggle those physical, mental health and other types of growth switches in ways that help the child develop towards being a happy, healthy, functional person. People are unique and not everyone's switches work in the same way or even at all. But for the most part, children will develop in a reasonably similar way for a given set of inputs. A good understanding of a child's history and experiences enables us to reflect on how those developmental switches may have been toggled for that child. We can never have perfect knowledge, but the more information we gather about that child, the more accurate we're likely to be. Children's family histories, their behaviour and emotional expression, what they tell you, observations from people who know them well, all of that gives us this information. When we're undertaking a child and family assessments, that's what we're trying to gather, that type of information, to specifically identify this specific child's specific developmental needs and what we can do to help them develop into the best person they can become. Some examples of changing needs over the course of a person's childhood, but also how we have identified how we can meet some of these needs. So these days, quite a lot of health resources and energy, money and so forth is put into antenatal and neonatal care. Antenatal care is the care that happens during a pregnancy, which focuses on providing what the fetus needs in order to become a healthy baby. Neonatal care carries that over after the birth of the newborn baby to give them what their tiny bodies need to get through the first few weeks of life. Those first few weeks are very risky. In the 1700s, so only a couple of hundred years ago, around 35 to 40% of all children would not survive their first few months, and fully half of all children wouldn't make it to adulthood at all. Since then, medical research, technology and practice has reduced that risk so that these days the worldwide infant mortality figure is under 4%, and in some countries it's down to 0.07%. We take it for granted these days that most babies will survive, but the next time you're walking through a cemetery, look at some of the older gravestones and see how many babies from the pre-1900s died within the first 2 or 3 months of life. Depending on where you are, you will see some headstones which has 7 or 8 children in the one family who die very young, and maybe only 1 or 2 of them make it to become adults. The reason for this improvement in childhood mortality is that we have worked out what young babies' needs are, and we can meet those individual needs depending on what that baby requires. So for pre-birth and newborns, when we're talking about their needs, mostly we focus on providing the things that they require for good physical health development, at least until they're out of that danger zone of the first couple of months. Lots of this is around nutrition and sustenance, keeping them warm and clean, etc. But affection and touch are also incredibly important. Studies have found that premature babies who have physical contact with another person, usually their mum, in the first few weeks while they're still in the incubator and so forth, have much better outcomes than those who don't. And these outcomes can be measured definitively even 10 years later. I'll put a link to that in the show notes as well, that study. Now, as children get older, their development goes in various directions. Physical development is still important, including their ability to move. We call that gross motor skills and fine motor skills, but also their personal social skills and communication and language skills. If you're interested in this area, you can look at the Denver 2 developmental scale. Again, link in the show notes. That goes into what children should be able to do at various ages between 1 month and 6 years when they're developing along standard lines. I'll talk more about this in a later episode. Now, these elements all interconnect with each other in complicated ways, but where a child's need for, say, affection was seriously interrupted or insufficiently met when they were about 2, that will have an impact on who that child is at 6. Now, I'm talking about persistent emotional neglect here, not reasonable guidance and boundaries that the child just doesn't respond well to, or one-off occasions when a parent acts badly towards that child. So we're talking where this child's emotional needs are relatively high. Maybe they become really needy and indiscriminate as to where they get affection from because they don't know when or if they're going to get consistent affection again in the future. Maybe they'll push people away because they expect that everyone will reject them eventually, and at least if they do the rejecting, they've got control of what's going on. Maybe they'll be aggressive and violent towards others because at least that gets some attention, even if it's not positive. Maybe they try to do really well at school and hope that that will get someone to like them. Maybe they'll withdraw into themselves and try to bury their feelings. Maybe they'll develop insecurities and anxieties. Maybe they'll try to be entertaining in order to get liked. Maybe it'll be a few of these things mixed together. Maybe it'll be something else. Every child's different. And again, just to be clear, I'm talking about when these behaviours are extreme, not just minor behavioural traits or phases that the child's going through. Now, none of that will specifically be conscious in the child's mind. They won't know that they're acting because of those reasons. It'll just be the behaviour that comes naturally to them given how they're feeling. The lack of affection and emotional neglect when they were 2 toggled those developmental switches and contributed to how they interpret the world. And now that they're 6, you're seeing behaviour which is based on that interpretation of the world that was switched on when they were 2. If we want to change it now that they're older, we have to work out what we can give the child in order to toggle the switches now to help them build a healthier interpretation of the world going forwards. This connects with the relationship between stimulation and learning I described in a previous episode. Just as learning takes place within the child's head based on the stimulation that we give them, so does the child's interpretation of the world is inside their head. It's based on their experiences. Now, we can't just give the child the feeling that the world is a safe and happy place, but we can give them the experiences which may help them develop that feeling themselves. In this case, affection, consistency, etc. Again, these are very complex things. It's not a direct causal connection between the earlier lack of affection and the current behaviour. You can't see a 6-year-old who really craves attention and assume it's because they were just denied affection earlier and call that assessment done. You need to do the digging to get as much information as possible on which to base your assessment. Many of the emotional and behavioural difficulties we encounter include aspects of trauma as well, which is where your trauma-informed practice is important. So when we're undertaking child and family assessments, we are identifying 1, where the child's development is physically, mentally, emotionally, socially, etc. 2, what has been happening in their lives that could impact on their development. That is, whether their developmental needs have been met or are currently being met, or if there's any gaps that we need to meet. 3, whether their parents and carers are able to meet any needs which aren't currently being met very well or haven't been met in the past, including any needs that may stem from trauma. 4, how that child is expressing their needs. Children express their needs in very complex ways. I'll be going into that in a future episode, and that's also going to cover what we mean by the voice of the child and how we put that when we're writing up assessments. So thank you for watching. Please like this video, subscribe to the Social Worker Saga channel. It really does help in terms of promotion in the search results in YouTube. The YouTube algorithm is unforgiving, so any support you can give in this regard really does help. Thanks very much. Bye.